Hello, I'm Pat McAfee.
I'm Nick Saban.
No, this is not College Game Day. I'm Jake Stone.
I'm Jesse Owens.
And this is another episode of Generally Particular, a production of the London Lyceum. Generally Particular is a show dedicated to discussing and reflecting on the whole Baptist story. We are a show by Baptists, about Baptists, and for Baptists, as well as Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, because it's fresh on my mind, even if there are some old light and new light Congregationalists. I'm a Calvinist Baptist. Jesse is an Arminian Baptist. In the 17th and 18th centuries, we would have been known as a particular Baptist and a general Baptist. And so we've brought those together in what we think is a fun way to form generally particular. Jesse would have been an Arminian old light, one of those that Jonathan Edwards was preaching against.
Yeah.
I am supposed to be a new light.
Jake would have been a Calvinist old light.
I'm supposed to be a new light because I am an Isaac Backus man. But I have to say, in reading some of those things on the Great Awakening, I get some of the critiques of the old lights. So.
Well, maybe some of the critiques were fair.
I think so. I think there were some things that were right. I think it's one of those things where the old lights could have used some nuance too in some of their critiques, but they had some validity.
Yeah. This isn't the episode for revival and revivalism, but I don't know. There were some fair critiques, probably.
Yes, there were. And so today what is today?
I don't know, but can we both agree that Solomon Stoddard halfway covenant thing, man, you thought infant baptism was bad, but got even worse then.
You know, it's always fascinating to me that those early Congregationalists came over and they wanted to establish that almost what we would call regenerate membership in order to be a part of the church. Didn't take long that they realized that in order to continue their state of new Christendom and the church, that they were not going to be able to enforce regenerate membership. And voila, the halfway covenant was born. And,
turns out that maintaining that sort of godly society might require paedobaptism, and maybe not even the baptism of believers, but of the grandchildren of believers.
Yeah. Mark Knowles said that they domesticated their desire for church purity to maintaining a godly civil society. See, folks, that's why we say that you can't be a Baptist nationalist. It just doesn't fly. In the words of Brandon Askew, that dog just won't hunt. So.
Oh, man. We need a John episode with Brandon Askew.
Yeah, we do, even though he's a Bunyanite as well. So today is what is today? September the
4th.
September the 4th is when we're recording this. So we're moving into soon, officially, the fall season.
Well, clearly we're already thinking about football season. That's
football
clear.
is already here.
Yeah.
And the pumpkin spice lattes are flowing already at Starbucks. Although I have to confess, for all of the critiques that people might give me for coffee, I have never had a pumpkin spice latte, nor do I have any desire to get one.
Do you like pumpkin flavor at all?
I will eat a piece of pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving.
Well, then you should try a pumpkin spice latte.
But sounds like you are acquainted with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm willing to admit I'm for the most part a black coffee man, but the pumpkin spice latte, I usually get one at least a season. So
at least one, audience. Notice, at least one, which means there have been years where there has been consumed more than one by Jesse.
Yeah, they're kind of sugary, so they're almost a little too sweet. So
don't try that. Don't. So
that's
try
a critique.
So.
I'm just trying to contextualize. I'm trying to, be friendly with you and your coffee choices and talk about, once a year have a pumpkin spice latte.
Well, I was up at 5:15 this morning, which is not normal for me. And I was getting up because we had our initial meeting of the Kiffin Room here on campus, where we gathered together to read Baptist primary sources, which is part of the inspiration for our episode today, where we're going to be reflecting a little bit on Adonirum Judson. And so we're going to be reading in our group Judson's work on Christian baptism. And so we're meeting at 6:30 in the morning because I know early mornings are the best time to try to do things, and I'm willing to sacrifice sleep to talk Baptist history and theology.
Wow.
So I had to make a cup of coffee this morning. And of course, true to form, I only had the 1 scoop of sugar in my coffee this morning instead of my normal 3.
I'm proud of you. So Jake was telling me about the Kiffin room and that they were meeting at 6:30, and I was like, wow, that's early, man. I'm proud of you for getting that going early. And he said something like, why we're meeting at 6:30, and I'm trying to think of something significant. And he said the reason we're meeting at 6:30 is in commemoration of the time we were supposed to go on a run at 6:30 a.m. at ETS, and you stood me up. So,
it was not I that stood you up; it was you that stood me up.
Yes.
We want to
Jake,
make that clear.
all this to say, Jake holds a grudge.
No, I just remember dates. As a good historian should.
Was it Denver? Where were we at?
No, we were in Fort Worth.
Fort Worth.
So what was interesting about that was my first ETS. So I'm not at Jesse's level. Jesse's at a higher level of the elites down there than me, because he's been down there longer and gives presentations, and he schmoozes with them at the late night gatherings.
Arminian Baptists have often been critiqued of being elites who schmooze around with the important.
Yeah, I think you go over to the Seventh-day Adventist gathering. I think that's kind of more.
What's funny is neither the Paedo-Baptist Calvinist or the Baptist Calvinist or the Seventh-day Adventist or the Wesleyans want anything to do with me. So
and see, I wanted to do something with you that morning, and
this is strengthening your case. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what was interesting about that trip was, I had been in Louisville for 5 months, and it had already started dipping down into the 30s and upper 20s here. And that ETS was down in Fort Worth. And I remember when I left Louisville, it was 38 degrees that morning in Louisville. And Jacob Denhollander and I flew down, and when I stepped outside in Fort Worth, it was about 80 degrees. And I thought, God bless Texas. I am home. And it was, it was warm, and it was not. And while we were down there, like that morning we were supposed to go run, it was like about 55, and there was a little bit of a breeze. And let me tell y'all, the best barbecue I've ever had was there in Fort Worth. Haim's barbecue, went there twice. Those bacon burn-ins, bless your
I can't
heart,
tell you how many people I have told about the bacon burn-ins.
And the ribs were good. They were falling off. Yeah. And but yeah, me and Jesse were supposed to go meet up in the lobby at 6:30, and there I was waiting, all alone. He decided sleep was more important than fellowship and exercise. So.
And I've never lived it down.
I haven't forgotten.
I've never lived it down since then.
We're going to let Jesse try to show penance in San Diego this year. So
yeah, Generally Particular is coming to San Diego.
We are. I think it would be fun to do kind of I think it would be great for us to do like little food videos of different places there in San Diego.
I was thinking we go down, down near the hotel on the waterfront, and we get a microphone and we ask questions about Baptist history. We just ask random people about Baptist history.
Ask random ETS presenters.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't have to be people from San Diego. We could just ask ETS people about it. So
I've never been to California, so I'm very excited about the opportunity.
You're excited about when you think of California, what do you think of? Ronald Reagan?
Yes.
That's what I figured.
A distant age in the past that I look fondly upon. A time before I was born when Republicans won California in presidential elections. That's hard for me to comprehend.
That is hard to comprehend.
In my lifetime. So
it's also hard to comprehend how all those churches, evangelical churches, got in Southern California.
Yeah, Paul Sanchez has posted interesting tidbits and thoughts he's had of like papers or studies he'd like to do. I mean, not just on evangelicals, but even like how Southern Baptists end up getting to, to California, and establishing a seminary. I mean, it is kind of
Yeah.
fascinating to think about. And
Yeah. There's
yeah,
there's an interesting book called From Bible Belt to Sun Belt that traces a little bit of that migration out. That's pretty interesting.
and I think even our Anglican friend Miles Smith has talked a lot of times about how it's very interesting to think about what we would consider modern evangelicalism. So let's say 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s have their roots in California. And I think most people, when they hear evangelicalism, are thinking Deep South. And as the Deep South is the mover and the shaker, but it's not really that. It's a lot more is from California than maybe some would realize.
So that this is part of the argument of the whole Reagan winning governor of California is that map towards his being elected was exported from California and created into a national campaign. And I think that's part of the argument about some of the things that you're saying is that some of it was patterned after some of the successes in Southern California.
Yeah, and I think, for example, most people, the way that stories get told is that it was Southern evangelicals that put Ronald Reagan in the White House. And that's kind of, I would say, sloppy and lazy historical work, because Ronald Reagan could have lost every state that was a part, for just understanding the region, the old Confederacy. And he could have lost all those states to Jimmy Carter, and he would have still won a landslide victory. And in fact, most of the states in the Deep South, Reagan only beat Carter by a very small margin. So it wasn't Southern evangelicals that put Reagan in the White House. I think that's an overblown statement.
Yeah. Yeah. You have a Bush Reagan t-shirt?
I do. I've worn it on this show before. I actually thought about, so Friday is the extravaganza at Southern, the fall festival. I actually have thought about, should I wear my Reagan Bush 84 shirt to that? But I don't want to cause any controversy, so I probably won't do that.
Well, is that controversial on Southern's campus?
No, not necessarily, but I don't want to be walking around with a political, like I'm political thing. So
I was afraid we were going to have a second edition of a book.
No, not that. So,
but actually, apparently Reagan's controversial even among conservatives today because he's not representative of true historic conservatism. Apparently,
no, he is. That's the problem. He actually does represent true historic conservatism.
Oh,
the difference is that what is being called conservative today is really fringe populism.
Oh,
and I think that's the big issue. Is that even people, like I've seen somebody tweet recently about Donald Trump, said that he campaigns as a hard right conservative. No, he's not a hard right conservative. He's a hard right populist. And there's a big difference between the two. Conservatism does not want to destroy and tear down institutions. That's not what conservatism is about. That is populism in many ways. Populism is about tearing down institutions that are seen as the issue. I don't know how we got onto this subject because it's not the point of this episode today.
This is what people are here for. They're going to see the title of this episode and think they're going to get reflections on Adonirum Judson. And instead, they're going to get.
So you're saying that we're deceiving people.
Instead, the first 15 minutes are going to be about food, coffee running, and Reagan Bush. A little bit of Donald Trump.
We also talked about the history of evangelicalism as well.
That's true.
So that was part of this.
And how we would have been both old lights.
Yes, although you would have been a part of that Dutch Arminian rationalist. I've heard Dr. Wills has talked about that a few times in the last 2 weeks, about the difference between the Dutch rationalist and the Wesleyans. And I thought, Jesse says he's not a Wesleyan, so he must be a Dutch rationalist. They became Arians and deists. So,
yeah, I mean, that's true. The sort of second generation, not even second generation, but after the death of Arminius, the Remonstrants, some of them went pretty far afield. That's true.
Wow, it took 5 years? Man, didn't take long.
Well, I would just add to that, so did many of the Presbyterians. But, the typical narrative as well, the Presbyterians actually became Arminians, and then they became heterodox. So it's all just whatever the convenient argument is. So
it's called "We Won, So We Write."
Yeah,
the right way.
Yeah,
our way.
I'm not bitter. I'm just
Please.
I'm just a little.
Please. You still hold. You talk about grudges. Jesse Owens still holds a grudge against John Gannot, who has been dead for over 200 years.
Well, I mean, they got. Yeah, I mean, sure, it was the 1750s, but he almost killed my denomination's people out. So
not physically or
no,
literally.
it was through proselytizing. It wasn't proselytizing like the Crusades. It was a different form of proselytizing.
He was trying to help them mortify their flesh and become alive in Christ.
Oh, brother!
He baptized George Washington, so that should cover for
we don't. Do we know that he really baptized George Washington?
There's a painting of it.
Well,
so
I started to say there's also a painting of George Washington at praying at Valley Forge, but
I believe that. That's what I thought.
Okay.
So,
I'm not saying he didn't. I'm just saying I don't think we know that.
Well, there are certain legends that are just too good for us to ignore.
So we talked a little bit about the Congregationalists because today we want to talk about the Congregationalist Adonirum Judson. And this is generally particular where we're thinking about Baptists. So Adonirum Judson was a Congregationalist who became a Baptist. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. Jake, why don't you get us kicked off with some introductory thoughts on Adonirum Judson?
Well, Judson was born in 1788. So speaking of George Washington, he's born a year before Washington becomes president. And he dies in 1750, about a decade before the Civil War begins. He grows up in the home of a Congregationalist minister. In fact, Adonirum Judson is Adonirum Judson Jr. His father was Adonirum Judson Sr. And not only was his father a Congregationalist pastor, but was a very ardent confessional Calvinist. And the reason that's important is because the Congregationalist church as a denomination was beginning to embrace more and more Unitarianism. And so Judson's father kind of is a bulwark of what we would say is the old paths.
And, yeah. And, I love the story about he goes to Brown University, which is
Judson the son, Judson Jr.
Yeah, Judson the son. He goes to Brown, Rhode Island College in Providence there. And the reason is because Yale is too far and Harvard is too liberal. So that says something about his father. Yeah.
Yeah. Although his father was not enthusiastic about him going to Brown either.
I get it.
Yeah, issues with Brown. But his father will be essentially fired from 3 pastorates because they feel like he is too dogmatic in his confessional theology and warning against these trends. The thing that I love that I was not aware of until doing some reading yesterday, Judson's father becomes a Baptist at the end of his life, which is, just fascinating to me that happened to his father as well. But Judson goes to Brown. He becomes a good friends with a man named Jacob. I'm assuming it's Eames is the way to say it, or would you say it's Ames?
Yeah, it's Eames. I typically say Eames, but I suppose it could be either.
So we're going to go with the Mississippi pronunciation.
Someone can comment and give us their opinion.
So we're going to go with Eames. And Eames and Judson were roommates. They were close friends. They were kind of also competitors in the sense that they were both brilliant in academics and who was going to finish higher in the class. But Eames was a deist, and he would love to debate Christians. He mocked the notion of the Trinity, the notion of eternal hell, substitutionary death of Christ, etc. I mean, you name it, what we would call the tenets of orthodoxy, he mocked. There comes a time where Judson will stay at a hotel in Connecticut, I believe, and the way the rooms worked in those days is that a drape or a curtain is what separated and marked off rooms, and he hears over the other side of the curtain a young man in agony and torment. He's dying. A minister has went in there to go plead to him, and the next morning when Judson is going to leave, he asks about the fate of that young man, and he's told he died.
Yeah, and as he's in the room, he hears the man, wailing, and he becomes concerned about his own mortality and his own soul, and that he's deviated from what his parents have taught him. And he's a little embarrassed by it. Like, so it's in the next day, kind of in the morning light, he had been afraid at night. And as the sun is shining into his room, he's kind of embarrassed that he's had these thoughts. And he kind of wonders to himself, what would Jacob Eames have thought of me, having these fears? What would he have said to me? And so then the narrative continues.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. Francis Wayland, who wrote an early biography of Judson, wrote about that experience, and he said one single thought occupied his mind, and the words "dead," "lost," "lost" were continually ringing in his ears. He knew the religion of the Bible to be true. He felt its truth, and he was in despair. And so he enrolls soon after, in 1808, into Andover Theological Seminary.
Well, are you going to finish the story then?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, so pertinent to the story is he's worried what would Eames think about him. And he's the one who's kind of led him to embrace sort of deist approach to his personal beliefs. And what he finds out the next morning is that it was actually Eames who was on the other side of that curtain.
Yeah, Eames was that's who died. Yes.
Yeah, who had died next to him. So here he is with this guy who's been influential in leading him to kind of depart from Orthodox belief. And he's worried about what would this guy have thought with me? And then in the next morning, he kind of is embarrassed that he had those concerns about his own soul, but only to find that it was that very same Jacob Eames who had died next to him during the night. And he had been oblivious to the fact.
Yes. And so it goes from there that he goes to Andover to begin studying. He will make a public profession of faith and join his father's church, which at that time was the Third Congregational Church in Plymouth, and sets his desire on soon after going into mission work. There are some men that come to Andover who had been a part of the Haystack prayer meeting, who many consider that to be the catalyst in some ways for the second Great Awakening. And Judson would talk himself later about walking on the grounds behind the college there at Andover and really just being inclined and giving himself up to going and taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. Now, we're not doing a full biographical episode on Judson. We're just kind of trying to set up some background, just kind of some reflections on him, because both Jesse and I have done a little reading on Judson, and just we were talking about this last night about, as I was going back looking at some of this stuff, just what a story from him. But I think that we need to hear this. This needs to be recorded, because I'm kind of curious if this was kind of Jesse's approach when he asked for his wife's hand from his future father-in-law.
Yeah.
Because when Adonirum meets Anne Hasseltine, he's smitten. He wants to marry her. Her father, John, is a deacon. And this was how Adonirum Judson asked for Anne's hand from her father. Quote, "I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure for a heathen land and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all this for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God?" That's powerful. Is that how you did it?
That's pretty much what I said to Tiffany's dad. Yeah, that's pretty much what I said.
We'll make sure we confirm that for the record.
Yeah. So the story is that Judson is meeting with a mission board in Bradford, Massachusetts, and he has lunch at Deacon John Hasseltine's home. And I think Anne is the youngest, maybe of four daughters, and he's immediately kind of taken with her. And apparently word had gotten out about Judson that he was an impressive figure. And apparently Anne was mostly unimpressed with what she saw at first, but eventually she came around. And then this letter that he writes to her father is pretty interesting. So maybe those who are listening to the show, maybe there's some unmarried college students or seminarians listening to this, and they might want to just look up that letter and make some small alterations and send that off to some girl's dad.
I wouldn't advise that. I don't think that would have the same effect today. But so we kind of just will move in this. They get married, and then the next day they're commissioned by this Congregationalist Missionary Society. There's a total of 8. One of the other ones is Luther Rice, and it is for them to go to Asia, to go to the heathens. Now, Jesse, they're going to set out to go and land in India. Who are they expecting to meet when they get there?
Oh man, you've put me on the spot. William Carey?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean,
yeah. I need to reach out to Sean Wright, Greg Wills, and Michael Aiken and say, I think we need to. We need to see about this PhD. He didn't even know who's in India.
It's like the end of the day, and I taught classes, and here I am. So.
I thought you were Baptist to the bone.
That's true. It should just be in my bloodstream.
Yes, I mean, you should wake up at 2:30 in the morning.
Didn't I? Okay, but didn't I answer your question correctly? It just took me a second. I just had to get things going.
He's challenging me, folks. So and who besides William Carey would he expect to see there?
William Ward.
And
no, I don't know.
The Serampore Trio.
Yeah. Well, there was a little bit of conflict between them.
4, 3, 2.
I don't know, Jay. Give it to me.
Joshua Marshman. Oh. All right. So,
now, who did they have the conflict? Who's the conflict with?
Well, the conflict comes later with some of the next generation, some younger guys.
Okay.
We don't really remember their names for a reason. But that doesn't happen until a few years later. That's after the death of Fuller dies, and then Sutcliffe and those guys. So that's a little bit later in the decade. But that'll be soon. But no, but that is they know, because the fame of Carey is in America by this point.
Yeah.
And even the Congregationalists and all of them, most of these people, Protestants, were admiring what these Baptists were doing. And so they know that when they get there, that they're going to meet the English Baptists. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that the United States and Great Britain are about to be at war with each other. This is in 1812. So the War of 1812 will have begun by the time they get to India. So Judson spends this 4-month voyage preparing to answer the attacks, because he believes that when they get there, that Carey and Ward and Marshman are going to, in the words of Dr. Driver, bring out the Baptist artillery and come on at them about their paedo-baptism. So Judson really wants to be firm in his convictions about why he believes in sprinkling.
But he ran into a problem.
He ran into the Bible.
That's the problem. That's the problem.
And so during this study, Judson said, these were from his own words, said that I, who was christened in infancy on the faith of my parents, have never yet received Christian baptism. And his wife, Anne, is distressed by this. And she, pleads with him to come back to the paedo-baptist convictions that they have. So now what's fascinating is when they get there, Carey and them say nothing. Carey and them receive them warmly. They don't bring up anything about baptism. I also find it just fascinating that these two groups were at war with each other. Their nations were at war with each other, and that had no impact whatsoever on Carey and them receiving Judson and the others. There's 2 ships that go over. So Luther Rice is on another ship at this time. So they get there, and then Judson writes a letter to Carey, Marshman, and Ward, and says, I know this will surprise you, but I've come to realize that I've not been baptized. And he asked them for Christian baptism. Anne becomes convinced of believers' baptism. And she writes home. So on September the 6th, Adonirum and Ann Judson are baptized by William Ward there in Calcutta.
Yeah.
The next,
And Anne says,
and Anne writes a letter the next day to a friend
yeah,
and says, quote, "Can you, my dear Nancy, still love me, still desire to hear from me when I tell you I have become a Baptist?" I
yeah.
mean, so it gives you an insight that we're still at a time when being a Baptist did not help your social standing whatsoever.
I think there's another letter from her on September 7th or something like that, where she says, we are confirmed Baptists, not because we wish to be, but because truth compelled us to be.
It's that same letter to that
Yeah,
same, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And so they are, they're baptized. And then what's fascinating is then when Luther Rice finally arrives to India, he shares that he has studied the scriptures and he has also become convinced of believers' baptism. And he is baptized on November the 1st as well. So now think about this. Out of the original 8 missionaries the Congregationalists sent out to this mission, 3 of them they've lost. They've become Baptists. And so they have to write back to the Board of Commissioners, let them know. And we need to understand that at that time, then, Adonirum, Ann, and Luther Rice have no income. They're unemployed now. They can't
Yeah.
they're not going to get money from the congregation.
And I think that's the thing to keep in mind, thinking about their embracing believers' baptism is like, this is not an insignificant decision.
No, it's not. No.
They lost all fund. They would have lost all funding. Would have been their expectation. We're going to lose all funding, and they embraced it nonetheless.
And so what I think about kind of reflecting on Judson and what he did and so then this is what I love. So 3 weeks after they're baptized, this sermon gets preached. That is what this book is. This is the sermon that he delivered. And he credits in the preface using Abraham Booth's Paedobaptism Examined. And here's one of the things I just want to stop, and I know this sounds nerdy probably, but just bear with me for a minute. Abraham Booth had been dead for 6 years by the time Judson becomes a Baptist. This man would never know that this work of his would be influential and used by one of the greatest missionaries who's ever lived. And it's a reminder that the work that we do in the kingdom is not done in a vacuum. What we do has ripple effects long past our time. And I just, that kind of stuff kind of is always just marvels me to think about, that a man, though he is dead, yet he still spoke because he spoke truth. And Jesse's just always sad because Abraham Booth used to be a General Baptist.
Well,
and then he became a particular Baptist. And don't make the joke that he went back when he went to heaven, that he returned as.
Well, he did, but I mean, we can do that another time. Yeah, Booth, Keach, it's sad, but I'm try to let it all go. Let it go. Like Jake said earlier, we're not trying to examine every aspect of Judson's life, but it is important to point out not only the letter that he wrote to Judson's to Anne Hasseltine's father, maybe anticipating some of the difficulty and the opposition that they would face, but they absolutely faced that. And Judson faced it. And Anne gave birth to a stillborn baby in the Bay of Bengal, I think. And they had to bury the baby at sea. And Judson dies. And Judson ministers in Burma for like 35 years. And another of his wives died. He ends up being married 3 times. In fact, there's an interesting book that I think that's something like the 3 Mrs. Judsons, or I think is the title of it. And Judson had to figure out, especially after Anne died, I think it was, how was he able to care for his own children? And that's one of the conversations he has to have. Does he leave some of his children with family back in the States, or what does he do? He ends up in prison. He faces all sorts of opposition. and ministers for 35 years. And these are all sorts of difficult things that Judson and his fellow missionaries faced, and they weren't things that they took lightly.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, for example, just like it was years for Carey before they had their first convert who was a native Indian. I mean, Judson, it's 7.5 years after they leave America, 6 years after they arrive in Burma, that they finally have their first convert who is from a native of Burma.
Yeah.
And they will organize, they'll organize a church, and there's 18 total there. By 1826, 13 years after they had arrived in Burma, Anne has died. Their 3 children have died. He had been in prison for 21 months. The 18 members that were there by this point are either dead or dispersed. And he destroyed, Brown had at that by that time given him an honorary Doctor of Divinity. He wrote Brown and said, please revoke it, remove it. I don't deserve it. He asked for all of his correspondence to be burned. He gave all of his wealth that he had personally to the Baptist board, and he builds a hut deep in the jungle. He dug a grave next to the hut because that's how dark life was for him. And that he just, and reading this line that he went 40, and he goes 40 days, he goes deeper into the jungle to be totally isolated. He told his sister back in New England to burn all the letters and correspondence. And he wrote this, he said, God is to me the great unknown. I believe in him, but I find him not.
Yeah.
And I think all of us have reached or been in some place like that. And what I find fascinating, what's instructive, is the whole time he's in this deep, dark valley, he made himself keep translating the Bible into the language of the Burmese.
Yeah.
And I think it's a great testimony that you and I don't always feel like reading our Bible. We don't feel like praying, and there are more times than not when we do those things and we don't feel like anything's been accomplished. We didn't get anything out of it. We just feel dry. And yet God uses all of those ordinary things to preserve us in ways we don't even realize. Judson's just daily diligent translating is what probably kept him alive and kept him persevering through all of that.
Yeah, and he ends
up. Side note, real quick: that Bible that he will complete is still what they use today.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So he creates a Burmese dictionary and a Burmese Bible, and that translation is still in use today. Yeah,
yeah, and so that's just a great lesson for us. And then later in life, he develops in 1838, 1839, where he can't really talk anymore. He can't get above a whisper. So oral communication becomes very challenging. I mean, I love to talk. I could, and nobody's ever said that I'm quiet spoken by any means. And so it's hard for me to even imagine going a month, let alone 11 years, and you really can't speak very loudly. And so just, he really, he suffered a lot, but I love that the scene gets portrayed for us. He finally comes back to the United States in 1845. So he's never come back in that 32 years. And he can't believe when he arrives back, he's treated like a celebrity because all the Baptists, north and south, and as they've moved into the frontier, they know who Judson is. He's off put by it by some of the celebrity that he's treated with. But when he comes and tries to speak to gatherings, to churches and all, he has to have an interpreter up there with him because he only can whisper. I also found the other thing fascinating is that he commented and wrote that it was hard for him coming back because English had become his second language in a sense.
Hmm.
He did all of his reading and all of his writing and all that in Burmese to really saturate himself in the culture of the people. So he didn't really speak English much anymore.
Hmm.
And as somebody that struggled hard with Greek and Hebrew, it's just very hard for me to just think about, that. But the story of Judson is one of great perseverance in so many ways. I mean, even as you talked about, he is in prison because the British and the Burmese are at war, and he is tortured by the Burmese government. And yet, when he gets released, he said, "The only thing that I desire is to know is Christ crucified among these people." He had no hatred towards them.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, there's an account, I think, from 1824 where they've, cut his hair down to his scalp. His legs are bound to a rod that's raised, and he's basically resting on his shoulder and his head, and is deathly ill in a Burmese prison in the midst of this conflict. And then you think about the death of his children and his wives, and it's just wow. That he it's not hard to imagine how he ended up at that difficult, dark place. But like you said, that he pressed on, continued with the dictionary, continued with the Bible translation, and that he spent, like Carrie, so much time prior to even seeing a native convert to the Christian faith, but persevered in light of that is an incredible encouragement, I would say. The variety of things that the Lord used to enable him to persevere is incredible.
Two more quotes before we finish up that I love. So when he returns back from his time in America, he's it's not very long that he gets sick again. And, part of the treatment was for him to sail for a period on the Indian Ocean, thinking the salt air would help him recover. And so while he's on this voyage, one of his missionary colleagues is with him. And basically, as he's on the voyage, his colleague got the impression that Judson knew that he was about to die, probably. And Judson said this: "I am not tired of my work, neither am I tired of the world. Yet when Christ calls me home, I shall go with the gladness of a boy bounding away for his school. I feel so strong in Christ. He has not led me so tenderly thus far to forsake me at the very gate of heaven. No, I am willing to live a few years longer, if that should be so ordered. And if otherwise, I am willing and glad to die now. I leave myself entirely in the hands of God, to be disposed of according to his holy will." And then, and I don't know how this question got asked of Judson when he's in Boston, but one could maybe detect a hint, little bit of some skepticism and sarcasm. "Do you think the prospects bright for the speedy conversion of the heathen?" one man asked Judson. And Judson replied, "The future is as bright as the promises of God." And Judson is buried at sea. So there's no, because he dies when he's on that voyage. And so, you can go, I've been told somebody that's in our group today has been to the cemetery where there is a marker for Judson and his 3 wives and their work.
Yeah.
But there in Massachusetts, in the little town where he grew up, there is a Baptist church that has a marble tablet. And it says that Malden is his birthplace.
Yeah.
The ocean is his sepulcher. But I love this: "Converted Burmans and the Burman Bible, his monument."
Wow.
That's his legacy.
Yeah, there's a house in Malden that you can go and visit as well. But what you said there made me think. When I was a student at Southern, there were some Burmese students who
there's still a number at Southern today. Yeah.
Who are the direct result of the missions efforts of Judson and those of his generation. So to see the fruit of that, to see the fruit of that 200 years later, in the lives of flesh and blood individuals whose ancestors and then they heard the gospel through the proclamation of these people is startling. I mean, in such an incredible way, the providence of God, but to see the fruit of that is amazing.
So go buy a copy of Christian Baptism. Dr. Nettles says one of the best works on baptism he's ever read. So I mean, that's a seal of approval. And the Golden Shore, that's the classic. To the Golden Shore is the classic biography to read on Judson. If you want something a little shorter as an introduction, this is a great volume that B&H did. This collection of essays on Adonirum Judson.
Yeah, I think those are all good. To the Golden Shore, Dusing's edited volume. You mentioned Wayland's memoir, good as well. But thinking about Judson,
Noble Company, get the 12 volumes.
Yeah,
you'll be glad.
They're on sale. We looked earlier. Thinking about Judson, if you're not a Baptist and you're listening, we would say become Baptist. And if you already are a Baptist, then we would leave you as we always do, saying make sure to stay Baptist.
Stay Baptist, our friends.